Hello and welcome to the channel Windows versus Linux. In the last video we began to talk about how we can use a program in Linux called Wine in order to try to get Windows software to work within Linux natively. Now, I did say in that video that Wine is pretty hit and miss. There are a lot of programs that actually don't work with that program or don't work well using that program. So if you have a particular piece of Windows software that you're trying to get to run, this would be your next step if Wine doesn't work for you. So in this video we're going to be setting up a virtual machine in order to run Windows software. Now, virtual machines, you can basically think of a virtual machine as an operating system within another operating system. And they have many uses, that being one of them. Another use that they have is you can test out other operating systems before you actually install them on your system. So you could use this to test out other Linux distributions, you could test out Chromium OS, you could test out Mac OS if you wanted to. And of course, another really good feature that they offer is sandboxing. And what that is basically a security company can basically set up a virtual machine and purposefully download viruses and malware to test them out, see what they do, and how to protect against them. And that's essentially how the Windows 10 sandboxing works. That's how it protects your system. So, like I said, in this video we're going to be setting up a virtual machine in order to run Windows within Linux in order to run any software that we need to run. So to do this you'll need a program on Linux called Virtualbox. So if we go to the menu and go to the software manager, we will get that program. Alright, so we'll just type Virtualbox, all one word, and it should be the very first entry that comes up. Now, Virtualbox itself is just the program you use to create the virtual machine. We'll actually need to download an operating system to put on it, which you can run pretty much any version of Windows within the virtual machine, but I will tell you most versions of Windows will require you to have a license in order to install it, especially Windows 7. So if you happen to have an old laptop or desktop lying around with a license key on it that you don't use, you could try using that if you want to run like Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows XP, anything like that. But for the purposes of this video, we'll be installing Windows 10 because you can actually install Windows 10 without the license key up front. So we'll let this finish downloading. And like I said, we will need to actually download an operating system. So I'll put the link to this site in the description of this video in case you want to do this same setup. But this is Windows 10 Home that we'll be installing. So pretty much when you land on this page, it's going to ask you to select the edition of Windows 10. You have the Windows 10 October update or the May update. We're going to do the May update. And we're going to choose English as our language. And it'll ask you if you want to install the 64-bit or the 32-bit. Again, this depends on the architecture of your machine. If you're running on a computer, probably I'd say 7 years or older, you'd probably want the 32-bit, but most modern laptops or desktops will run 64-bit. So you would just click this, and I've actually already downloaded it because it is a pretty hefty download. So you would just choose where you want to download it to and then just hit save and it will download it for you. Okay, but since I already have it, we'll be good to go. Alright, so we now have Virtualbox, so we can go ahead and open that. Alright, so this is the program, and what we want to do is create a new virtual machine. So we'll click New. I'm just going to call it Windows 10. And as you can see, it's already defaulted to my correct settings, so obviously the type is Microsoft Windows, version is Windows 10, and the laptop I'm putting this on is 64-bit. So we'll hit Next. Now, memory size, whatever number it says here, Well, first I should tell you, for anybody that doesn't know, 1 gigabyte equals 1024 megabytes. So if you take 1024 and multiply it by 4, that's how many gigabytes you have. So this laptop that I have has 4 gigabytes of space on it, or 4 gigabytes of memory, I should say. Now, you don't want to go over half of what you have for your virtual machine. Okay, so since I have 4 gigabytes, I'm going to give it a little bit less than 2, and that should be fine with this. But if you have like 8 gigabytes, you could put it at 4, etc. Alright, we're going to create a virtual hard disk, and we're going to use the Virtualbox disk image. So pretty much all the defaults you can just leave. We're going to stick with dynamically allocated. And what this means is, like, let's say we set aside 20 gigabytes of space for our virtual machine. This will only use up to what it needs within that 20 gigabytes. If we set this to fixed size, it will use all of that 20 gigabytes. So this is the one we want to save space. Okay, here's where you actually set the amount of space the virtual machine has. And this is essentially like how much space your C drive would have. So one important thing is you want to not only allow for the amount of space for the operating system, but you also want to allow space for any programs you're going to be loading into that virtual machine. So Windows 10, I would say, takes probably around 20 gigabytes. So if you wanted to run like Photoshop or Microsoft Office on top of that, you would want space for that as well. Since I'm just installing the operating system itself, I can probably put this at 20. I'll go 30 just in case. Okay. And then you just create. And there we go. So we now have a Windows 10 virtual machine. But like I said, this is empty, so there's nothing on it. So we actually have to put that operating system on it. But first, we're going to go in and tweak the settings to give us the most performance out of it. So the first thing within this screen you need to do is go into System and Processor. And here you can set the amount of processors that virtual machine will use. Again, I would not go over half of what you have installed. So again, my laptop has 4 CPUs, so I'm going to give it no more than 2 right there. Okay, next you go to Display. This video memory, you want to give it as much as possible. So wherever this slider is, you just drag it all the way to the right. You also want to enable both of these, the accelerations. And I believe in storage, you want to set this little disk right here where it says empty. We may have to do this after installing, but you'll want to set this as whatever your DVD or CD drive is. And once you do that, you want to hit pass-through. So what this does is, whenever you put a CD in your CD tray, your virtual machine will also recognize that as well. So if you had software that you wanted to install on your virtual machine that only had a CD, you could put it in and your virtual machine would recognize it. I'm going to leave that as is, but we may need to change that in order to actually install Windows 10. So we'll just hit OK. Alright, so we're set up. You can either hit Start or just double click the operating system. And any of these things up here, you can just hit this little icon here where it says do not show this message again. Okay, so it says no bootable found. That's kind of what I expected, so we actually need to go in and change that CD thing. So we'll go back into Settings, into Storage, and this little disk, we need to set that as the image that we downloaded online. So we need to change that to Choose Virtual Disk, and we just need to navigate to wherever we downloaded that to. So here's the Windows 10. Okay, so pretty much what's happening here is the virtual machine is going to recognize that this is basically acting as an installation disk for Windows 10. And it's going to boot from that and install from that. So now if we run it, it should recognize, hey, I'm trying to install Windows 10, and there's our installer. So this will work for pretty much any operating system, and it's basically going to act like you were actually installing it on your system. Now, the good thing about virtual machine, like I said, is it does not affect your host operating system. So we're running Linux Mint, as you can see, but we're installing Windows within Linux. So none of your data, none of your programs on your actual machine is going to be affected by this. All right, so we'll just walk through this program, or this installation. I'll hit install, and I'll just speed this up so you don't have to sit through the boring parts of it. Okay, so here it's asking for a license. Now, like I said, you don't have to put in a product key with Windows 10. You can just say, I don't have a product key, and it will continue with the installation as is. So on this screen, you can choose any version of Windows 10 that you like. You can choose Home, Education, Pro, Pro N. I'm not even sure what that is, but we're going to do just the basic Windows 10 Home 64. All right, so we'll hit Next. We will accept the terms that we never read. Okay, now this screen, we're not upgrading, we're actually installing, so we're going to go to Custom. And as you can see here, this is essentially our virtual hard drive for the virtual machine. So you just click that and hit Next, because that's what we're actually going to be installing Windows on. Alright, and the installation is off, so I will see you back when there's something for us to do. Okay, so it did go ahead and install Windows 10, so now we just need to set up the final stages. When you come to this point, if you do install this version of Windows, if you don't want Cortana to sit there and talk to you continuously, you can just hit this little microphone down here and that'll shut her up. So, obviously we're going to choose the United States. Alright, we want US. We don't need to add a second keyboard layout, so we'll just skip that. Okay, here is where we actually create our sign-in account. So I personally would never recommend doing the Microsoft account. I would always use an offline account or a local account. Because this is just a hassle more than anything. So I would always choose the offline account, and it'll probably ask you multiple times if you want to, if you'd rather sign into a Microsoft account instead. Just hit no and create a local account. They're much easier to use, I think. Okay, so it's going to ask you for a username. I'll just put my standard for this. Okay, you can choose to put a password if you want to use a password to actually log into the virtual machine. If you don't put a password, it'll just automatically sign you in whenever you start it. Okay, we're just going to say no to this. We don't need this. Okay, we don't need a digital assistant. This is basically asking if you want to use Cortana. Again, I would recommend not using it. Okay, this screen, basically Microsoft is asking how much it wants to spy on you, so I would definitely turn all of these off. Everything that's checked, just switch it off. Okay, now here we are with Windows. We can go ahead and close this. Discoverable, no. Okay, so here we have Windows 10. This is the latest version of Windows 10. So as you can see, it's pretty much what you would have if you installed this on your actual machine. So you can put any software that you want on here, and it will work pretty much as well as it would in an actual Windows machine. Now the good thing about having Windows as a virtual machine is if you do happen to get any viruses or malware or anything like that, it will not affect your host machine. It would be contained within the virtual machine, so you don't have to worry about it getting out, affecting your files or anything like that. So you typically won't have to run any kind of antivirus on a virtual machine. You can just install it and run whatever programs you need. So there are a couple things I want to go over before we wrap this video up. There are a couple ways to shut down a virtual machine. You can either go to Start, Shut Down like you normally would in Windows, or you can hit the X in the top of the screen, and you have three main options here. The one that it's on right now, power off the machine, this would be like pulling the plug on a computer or pressing and holding down the power button until it shuts off. So this probably wouldn't be the best option. Send the shutdown signal would be essentially like going to Start, Shut Down, or you can save the machine state. So what this does is, like if you have some programs open and then you save the machine state and then OK, it will basically take a snapshot of whatever you had open, and then the next time you start the virtual machine, it'll pop you right back to where you left off. So that's really handy if you have some work that you're working on that you need to keep open to work on later. You can just do this and it'll pop you right back to where you were. Okay. But for right now, we're just going to send the shutdown, and we need to change one setting back in Virtualbox. So if we go back into the settings of that, we need to change this. We've already installed it, so we don't need this file anymore, this ISO file. So we can change this now to our DVD or CD drive of our computer. And then, like I said, change that to pass-through. So now, whenever we start our virtual machine, it will recognize whatever we put in the CD tray. Okay, I'll just shut this down normally. Actually, before I shut that down, if you ever want to use your virtual machine in full screen, you don't have to use it in windowed mode like this. There's two ways you can do that. You can either go up here to these buttons up here and click View, and then Full Screen. And it will ask you for confirmation if that's what you want to do. If you don't want to see this every time you do this, you can just click this to not show this message again, and hit Switch. So now you see that we have the virtual machine as full screen. If you want to get out of that, you just scroll all the way down to the bottom until this bar pops up. And then you can go View and Full Screen Mode again, and it will take you out of it. The other way to do it is with a key combination. So if we go to Input, Keyboard, Keyboard Settings, if we scroll down a bit, you'll see Full Screen Mode is Host plus the F key. Now our Host key currently is set to Right Control. Now if you have a keyboard or you're on a laptop that doesn't have a Right Control, I would advise changing this. So all you would do is just click on it and put whatever you want. I'll put Left Control, so you just hit whatever key you want and it'll change it to that. And then just hit OK. So now, if I just press Left Control plus F, it automatically puts me in full screen mode. And I would use that same key combination to get out of it. Okay? So, that is basically how you run Windows within Linux. Like I said, this does have its limitation. Obviously, it'll run only as well as the resources that you allot to it. And it will use some of the resources of your main machine that you're using. So it will run a little bit slow if you're on a slower machine or an older machine. So obviously the more memory you have in your machine, the more hard drive space, you'll be able to run virtual machines better, or you'll be able to run multiple virtual machines even if you wanted to. So you could have a Windows 10, a Windows 7, a Mac OS if you wanted to. You could have another Linux distribution virtual machine going. And depending on the amount of memory you can have multiple virtual machines running at the same time if you choose to do that. So if you happen to have any issues with this method of installing Windows software on Linux, in the next video and the last video of this series, we'll be looking at actually dual booting Windows with Linux. So essentially we're going to be taking part of our hard drive and installing Windows on it. So we have Linux on one part of the hard drive, Windows on the other part, and you can just boot into whichever you choose. But that's going to be a little bit more involved, so again, we'll cover that in the next video. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you then. Thank you very much.